Good evening. We're going to learn now Gittin Daf Amud Aleph. Just want to dedicate the shir for a refuah shlema for Reb David Nachman ben Yemichev Shifra, a real ben Teda, a real chassid. He should have a speedily refuah shlema, Bekar of Mamish. We're beginning now, like I said, Daf Chof Aleph Amud Aleph, and we're holding the top line, Elar Marava. So the Gemara now brought a question. The Gemara asked the Shaila in regards to Boy Rami Bar Chama, that if a woman owned a tablet, not like tablets that an electronic tablet, but like she owned a board, it's called a tablet, and the tablet belonged to her, and the get was written on this tablet. And the husband is the one now gives the get, the tablet, which had a chazakah that belonged to her, gives it to her. So the question is, do we say that she was makna the tablet to him or not? So that's what we're holding. That's the question. We brought one answer, then we said it's no good. Now we're holding Elar Marava. So Rava says, Mehacha. You could be paishit, you could resolve the suffix of Rami Bar Chama from the Mishnah Baba Basra. Now, what is the Mishnah Baba Basra? This is the end of Baba Basra. It says, Orev hayetze la'achar chitim shtaris, which means if there was a guarantor whose commitment came after the note was signed, so then the halacha is goyvim min achasim nechayrin. So then the creditor can collect from the guarantor's unsold property, which means in the old days, if there was a shtar halva, you had it's called a note, and a note showing that there was a loan, and it was signed, and the leiva now, the din is, the halacha is that the leiva has to give the malva this promissory note, and with that note, then the lender can collect. If the leiva doesn't pay, he can go to Beis Din and show the Beis Din that he has a shtar halva. Now, what happened was after the malva already received the leiva, the shtar from the leiva, what happened was the malva gave it to the orif, gave it to a guarantor, and the guarantor wrote on the shtar, Vani orif, that I am the guarantor. So now the din is, the halach of the Mishnah says, is that even though he signed Vani orif after the leiva already gave it to the malva, so he's considered like an orif for the malva, and the din is that if the leiva does not pay, so the malva can then go and collect from the orif from property which is free property. Now, what does it mean, property which is free property? This refers to property that the orif, that the guarantor has. Now, the din is usually whenever you have a shtar and you have a document, you're allowed to collect. If the malva has a document from the leiva, he's allowed to collect nechasim mishubadim, which means, literally means a property which has a lien. So if the leiva went ahead after he received the loan from the malva and he sold the property to a third party, so now the malva can come to the third party and collect it. That's called nechasim mishubadim. Now, the din is over here, since the orif went ahead and signed the shtar after the leiva gave it to the malva, so there is a yischayvus, but the malva, it's only a milva al peh. It's only like he got the loan oral, and he's not allowed to collect from the nechasim mishubadim. Now, what do we see from this Mishnah? We see that the shtar, even though when the leiva gave the shtar, it belonged to the malva, nevertheless, the orif now, this guarantor could be mishtabed himself to the loan. Now, the din is that if you're saying that the orif could be mishtabed himself, the Torah says that you need sefer mikna. And if so, if the makna now, the sefer, the makna is the orif, he can. So the chayred has to belong to him. So you must say that the malva is makna himself through a kinyan, a full-on kinyan, and he gives it to the orif, even though that he's going to give it back to him. So, and explains that the Mishnah doesn't make a difference between a Talmud Chacham or not. So we can learn from here that a regular person, he could be makna the shtar to the person with a matana gemura. So if so, just like we see over here, that the Orev can go ahead and that the Malvik can go ahead and makna the Orev, makna to the shtar to the Orev, so too a woman that gives this tablet to her husband, that she should write a get, so it's a chazaka that she was makna the shtar, the tablet to him, and therefore the get is a good get. Now, Rav Ashi now pushes off. He refutes the raya of Rava. He says, "Ma kusha, what's the question?" In other words, you can't bring a raya from that Mishnah. Why? Because Dilma Gavra Shani. Perhaps the shtar of a man is different. Why? The Yoda Laknuye, that since a man is very fluent with a business and he knows that a shtar is not kosher, that this shtar is not kosher if he's not makne with a matana gemura. So you could say that Mistama, he was makne to the Arif, but a woman who does not know properly how to be makne, I'll be chayshish that perhaps she was not makne this tablet to her husband, and therefore perhaps she's not divorced. So Elam Rav Ashi says a new answer. Mehacha, you could be paishi the suffix of Rami Bar Chama from the Mishnah, from the Mishnah that we're going to learn Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis. What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says that Isha Kaiseves es Gita. It says that a woman is allowed to write her own divorce. She's allowed to write her own get. And in other words, if a woman goes ahead and writes the get on her klaf and is makne, and then goes ahead and gives it to her husband, is makne to her husband, and then the husband goes back and gives her that get, the din is that it's a good gershin. And v'ha'ish, as well as a man, koisif shevrei. A man could write a receipt that he will receive from the woman after paying her ksuba. She'ein kiyum haget ela b'chesamov, because in order to ratify a get is only through signatures. In other words, it has to be the witnesses who signed on it, and not just the writing of the document or its receipt. Basically has no legal ramification and can be done by anyone. Now, what do you see from here? You see that a woman understands the need to transfer the get that will be given to her by her husband in the future. You see clearly from this Mishnah that the woman does understand to be makna. And therefore, since a woman understands she has to be makna, we say that the woman was makna to her husband with a matana gemura, and therefore she is considered divorced. Okay, now the next sugya speaks about like this. The domain of a person, he could be koina if a person gives somebody else something and he picks it up, so he's koina. The din is, the Gemara Bava Metzia says that Rishusei Shel Adam, the domain of a person, is also koina for him as well, even without his knowledge. Now, that's called, in halacha, that's called a kinyan chatzar, that the chatzar of a person could be koina for him. Now, a woman could be divorced as well if the husband puts her get in her chatzar. Now, sometimes also when it comes to metaltalim, for example, the kalim of the person, the kalim of the person also is considered like a chatzar to acquire for himself. Now, and we're going to learn different ramifications to what this means. So Amar Rava says, Kosav la get, if he wrote for her a divorce, he wrote a divorce for her, and Nusana biyad avdi, and placed this divorce in the hands of his slave. And then what happened? Because of the shtar matana, and then he wrote her like this deed, a gift with regards to the slave. In other words, he wrote a shtar that he's giving the slave as a gift to his wife. So he wrote her a get. He gave the get. He made the shliach, the eved. He gave it to the yad of the eved. He placed it in the hands of the slave, and then he wrote that the slave becomes a matana for his wife. So the Gemara Sarava says, then kina osoi. First of all, she acquired the slave because she has a clear document stating that the document is a matana. The document says that this slave is a gift for her, and umaskareshes boy, and she's divorced immediately by this get. In other words, we say like this: the slave, this eved, is considered like her property, and it is though the husband placed the get in her domain at the time that he transferred the slave to her, and she acquires the get mitzad chotzer. So again, we know chotzer shel adam is kaina, and a person can go ahead and place a get in the chotzer of a wife. So we say that when he gave, that this eved that was given to her as a gift, and who has the get, becomes the chotzer of the woman, and now it's miskadeshes. Okay, so now the Gemara asks, Va'amai, why do you say, what's the reason that you're going to say that she's divorced when it comes into the hands of the servant? Frag the Gemara, chotzer ma'aleches, you have another problem. This is considered a chotzer which is mobile, it's a moving chotzer. And we know the din is v'chotzer ma'aleches leikana. And when it comes to a mobile chotzer, it doesn't kaina, that's the din. The Gemara Baba Metzia says that when it comes to a chotzer which moves around, so then it doesn't work. It's not kaina. So l'chayr, this eved is a chotzer ma'aleches. Now, if you're going to say, Rav is speaking about that the eved was standing, so you can't say chotzer ma'aleches because the eved is standing. The Gemara Rav said, Kol she'ilu mahalech leikana, that if he has the possibility to walk, then he's not kaina. The husband, you cannot be kaina mitam chotzer. Even if Aimed v'yoshev, so Kol she'ilu mahalach leikana, so therefore Aimed v'yoshev leikana. Why? Because if he wants, he has the possibility that he could walk. So the l'cheira, when do we say that? Let's say a person could be kaina. Let's say the yad of a person. The yad of a person could be kaina. The chotzer of a person could be kaina. But when could a chotzer of a kaina be? When could a chotzer be kaina for a person? It's only if he is stationary, but not if it's a chotzer ma'aleches. So the Gemara answers, the halacha is that v'hilchasa and the halacha taught by Rava applies in a case of the kafus, that the eved was bound and unable to move. In such a case, he's not able to move, and it's not considered a chotzer ma'aleches. And therefore, if you have if the husband wrote a document to his wife, in other words, a get to his wife, and gave it to the servant, and then gave a shtar matana that the servant belongs to the wife, so she's kaina, the woman is kaina the eved because of the shtar matana, and automatically she also becomes divorced because we're talking about over here that the eved is kafus, is tied up, and it's kaina mitzad chotzer, her chotzer. Okay, now the Gemara says another din. Rava says, "Cause of la get if he wrote her a get, and he placed this get in her courtyard, and because of la shtar matana love, and he wrote a deed of gift with regards to the courtyard. So he wrote her a get and placed the get in his courtyard. And then because of la shtar matana love, and then he wrote a gift, a deed of gift, that the courtyard belongs to her. I'm giving the courtyard as a gift for her. So what happens? So the din is kina osei. So first of all, she acquires the chotzer because the husband gave a shtar matana that the chotzer belongs to her. And now where's the get? The get is in the chotzer that now belongs to her. So what's the din? The din is miskadeshes bay. The din is that she's divorced immediately in this courtyard. So we have two dinim. Rava said two dinim. Rava said, first of all, the case of kos of law, get unasana biad avdei, because of the shtar matana love, can also be miskareshes by. And the Rava said the din as well of get unasana bechatzeri, because of the shtar matana, can also be miskareshes by. So the Gemara says utzricha, and it was necessary for Rava to teach this halacha sai in regard to a slave and sai in regards to a chotzer. And the Gemara explains. The Ashmin and Eved, if he would have taught us only about a slave, the case of the slave, Havamina, so I would say Daf Eved. Only by a slave, then this the husband can transfer the get to his wife specifically through a slave. Abba Chotzer, but in regards to a courtyard, maybe Ligzar, maybe the Chachamim made a gzeira that this should not be a valid get. Why? Mishum chatzera haba la'achar miken, because due to the case of her courtyard that comes afterwards. Now, what's the case of chatzera haba la'achar mikan? In other words, we would not want to be matter in a case that if, let's say, for example, the husband placed the get not in his chutzner, but in somebody else's chutzner, and now the bala chutzner went and either sold the chutzner to his wife or gave it to her as a matana. So it comes out that the get was only placed there b'derech memela, and we know, like Rashi says, it has to be mikoyach habal. It has to be from the koyach of the husband, and if it comes from a koyach of the chutzner b'derech memela, so the din is it's not a good get midrabanan. So that's why we have to teach both cases. Now, if viyash min chutzner, and if viyash min chutzner, and if Rava would only taught the case of a chutzner, so I would say havamina dafka chutzner. I would say dafka a chutzner of an eved. But in regards to an eved, I would say that an eved that has the get is not kohen. Why? Because ligs are kafas atu shene kafas. Maybe the chacham made a decree with regard to a slave which is even kafus atu. Maybe he's not kafus. Kamash Malan. Therefore, Rava teaches us that in such a case, the get will be valid. So now Abaye says, he says like this, Michti, let us see. Chatzar meheches rabba. Where do we know that minatera, a woman could be divorced if the get is placed in her hand? So the Gemara says, miyada. This that the Torah says, v'nasan biyada, that you could place the get in her hand. So l'cha'ira, the Torah is telling us that she's not going to be divorced only in a place that the kinyan of the chutzner is similar to the kinyan of the hand. So what does it mean, v'nasam yada? Ma yada, just like her hands. In other words, just like the kinyan of the get in her hands is the isa, is applies bein midaita, bein bal karcha, whether it's if the woman wants it or without her will. In other words, that the woman is divorced even if the husband threw the get into her hand against her will. So just like that's the way yad works, af chatzera, so too her chutzner could be koine. The get for her is the isa, that the gershin applies bein midaita, bein bal karcha. Whether he gave the get in a chutzner which belonged to her already, that even if she doesn't want it, it's still considered a divorce. Now he says matana, but in regards to matana, in other words, a get that's put in the chutzner of the husband, which she's mekabel as a matana, midaita isa. So the kinyan is only chal, only with the ratzon of the woman. But baal karcha lesa, but you cannot divorce a woman against her will. In other words, because she could refuse to accept the matana, and b'derech meila, if she's not going to accept the matana, she's not going to accept the chutzner as a matana, so then she won't be divorced automatically. So the chayra maybe the divorce, even if it's with her will. Okay, so now. Okay, so now the Gemara says, so she says like this: Maskil Rishim Bar Ashi asked the Shaila, "V'hashluchas the Kabbalah." But what about this shteach the Kabbalah, where the woman appoints a shteach to receive a get on her behalf? So what's the din by shteach the Kabbalah? The medaita isa bal karchalesa, that which the shliach can act only with her consent, but not against her consent, not against her will. In other words, no one other than the woman can appoint the shliach lekabbalah to receive her get. And v'ha v'kohav shliach lekabbalah. And l'chera, he is a shliach lekabbalah. Now we know a woman is able to appoint a shliach to be mekabel.
How could it be a case that he's a shliach but he's not bar kocha?
Can I have a tissue? I'm sorry. What's the question?
What case would it be that shliach is a shliach from the Yisrael did not send him bar kocha?
Right. That's the point.
What's a shliach balkach? What's the concept of balkach? Someone forced her to send a shliach?
He cannot be a shliach for her against her will.
He appoints himself to be the shliach?
Yeah, without her consent.
But that's not a shliach.
Yeah, but
That's not a shliach.
that's the get. He claims that I'm being a shliach l'Kabbalah.
So what? I don't care. He can get out of here. He's an arguer. He's not a shliach. So what? Good question. Very good question.
Yeah, so it's a taka. I have to look into it. Okay, so he says this. Gemara says, Abaye can answer and say, "Otu shlichus miyadis rabbe." Do I learn out shlichus from the words her hand? I learn it out mivishila v'shilchis rabbe. I learn it from, and it says, and he sent and sends her out. In other words, we learn out from a different limud. Gemara says, I can tell you a second answer. That shlichus l'Kabbalah nam yashkachan bal karcha. We also find that the shliach l'Kabbalah can be effective against her will. How so? She can mekabel get lebita ktana bal karcha. That a father can receive a get of divorce for his ktana against her will. So the halachas of a shliach are therefore consistent with the halachas of her hand, and Abaye's question still stands. Okay. Now the Mishnah said, Al hakol kaisun asaget. You could write the get on everything, and then it says Al ha'olah shel zayis on the olive tree, and then the Gemara said, the Mishnah said, on the horn of the parah, and you give her the parah. Val yad shel even, you have to actually give the evet. Okay, so now the Gemara, you have to give the count, you give the evet. So now the Gemara says, Bishleimo. Okay, so now the Gemara says, why does the wife, the husband, need to give the wife the cow? She says like this: Bishle miyad the eved mele, in regards to when he's megarish with a get, which is written on the hands of the eved. So it's understood why the husband has to give the actual eved. Why? Because Loi, chafal from base, Loi efshel miktzaya. It's not possible to cut off his hand. So it's usher to cut off the hand of a slave. So therefore, and the get is written on the hand, is written on the it's written on the evet. So and he can't cut off the hands of the evet. So he has to give the whole evet. So the Gemara says, but ala karen shel parah, when it comes to the horn of a cow, the ktsaya v'litzvala, let him cut it off and give it to her. So why does the Mishnah say that he has to give her the cow? So the Gemara says, Amar Kra, v'kosav v'nasan la. Torah says, and he writes her and gives it to her. It says, v'kosav v'nasan la. In other words, mishen mechusar el ksiva u'nesina. That a get is only valid when it's lacking only writing and giving. Yotzazeh, to exclude the case of shemechusar ksiva, ktsitza u'nesina. In this case, he's lacking, in the case of the cow's horn, which is lacking the writing and the cutting and the giving. So since you have an additional step of cutting, which would require that you have to actually cut off the horn itself, so the horn will not be a valid case of divorce, and therefore he has to give the cow. Why? Because it has to be a ksiva and a sina right away. And in the case of the cow, you wrote the get on the horn of the cow, and then now you have to go ahead and actually cut it off and then give it to her. So then you have an extra step, and the Torah says v'kasav v'nasan. Okay, the Mishnah said, Rabbi S Greenwald says that you don't write the get not on anything which has a ruach chayim and not on also foods. So the Gemara says, my time in Rabbi S Greenwald, what's the reason why Rabbi S Greenwald holds that this get is possible? So he says the time you learned in a brisa. It says in regards to the halachas of Gittin, because of law, safer. It says that the Torah says because of law, safer. that he writes to her for her a sefer, which means sefer krisis. So the Brisa says, "Ein li ella sefer." I learned from here that the only way that you could divorce, one could divorce his wife, is with a sefer. In other words, with a document that's written on like a parchment. Asks the Brisa, "Minayin the Rabbi is called dover." So where do we know that you can include other things as well, that it's kosher to write on the get? Talmud Leimer, that's what it says, "Because of law." So why does it say because of law? The Torah could have said v'nasan biyad sefer krisis. Why does it say v'nasan because of law? Teaches me that mikol makom, that every shtar gershon, we don't care what material is written on. So now the Brisa asks, Im kain, if so, ma Talmud Leimer sefer. Why does the Torah say dafka sefer? Sefer is mashma that you have to write a mamish on a cloth. So the Gemara says that the sefer comes to teach me that it has to be written on something which is similar to a sefer. Ma sefer davar she'en beruach chaim ein eichel. Just like we know, a sefer Torah is not something which is alive, and there's no food there. So therefore, and we know that it's right. The Torah says because of a sefer. So just like a sefer, it does not have ruach chaim and ein eichel. Af kol davar, so too other things she'en beruach chaim and eichel. We're talking about things that you could write on a get which don't have ruach chaim and don't have eichel, and that's what Rabbi S Greenwald does with. He learns it out from the words because from the fact that the Torah says the get has to be a sefer. So for that the Gemara v'Rabbanan and the Chachamim will tell you that why does the Chacham argue on Rabbi S Greenwald? So he says iksiv, if the Torah would have wrote bas sefer, in other words, if the Torah would have wrote because of la krisus bas sefer kidamis, then you're talking right that the get has to be written dafka on a klaf. Hash the ksiv. Now, what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says that you should write for her sefer krisus. It doesn't say bas sefer, which means the svidas dvarim huda also. That the word sefer is not coming to tell me the sefer like we think, but rather that you have to write a document which tells over about the divorce between them. And therefore you could write it on any language, any document. So now the Gemara says, "V'Rabbanan hai v'kosav my avdilon." What do they do with the extra word v'kosav law? So the Gemara says, "Mi boyelei b'ksiva miskareshes v'enim miskareshes b'kesav." It teaches us that a woman's divorced only through writing, but she's not divorced by giving money. So I would have said that I learn a hekish for yitzia to havaya, divorce from becoming married. Ma havaya b'kesav, af yitzia nami b'kesav. Just like we know the Mishnah says, "Isha niknas b'kesav." So I would think that yitzia also could be b'kesav. Kamash malan. Therefore, the Torah teaches us because of law that it's only through a get and not anything else. So now the Gemara says, "V'idach." And the other Tana, Rabbi S Greenwald, where does he know this from? Nafkalam is Sefer Krisis. He learns this out from Sefer Krisis. Sefer Kursa, which teaches us that a written document divorces her from her husband, and Ve'ein davar acher kursa. So now the Gemara says, V'idach, and those who hold the other opinion, and the Chachamim, what do? So he says, they need, this requires that the get must be something that severs all connections between him and her. The time like we learned in a Brisa. If a man says to a woman, this is your get, on condition that you will not even drink wine. Or he says, I'm giving you a condition that this is your get, but you're never going to go to your father's house. So what's the din? The din is, La'olam ein ze krisis. You should know, this is never a krisis.
You can't make a condition like that.
You can't make a condition like that. So that's the word. If a get imposes a condition upon the woman that basically permanently still binds her to her husband, so basically the Torah says sefer krisis. It has to be something which is severed completely. And the fact is by making these conditions, you're not severing completely. Now, he says, but if you say that, or he says, if however he makes a condition until 30 days have passed, So then, how's a krisis? So why? Because the get is valid, because we know the relationship will be terminated after 30 days. So the Gemara says v'idach, and the other one, the other Tana, Rabbi S Greenwald, from where does he know that the Tanai without a termination invalidates the get? So he says mikaris krisis. He learns it out from karis krisis. Torah could have said sefer karis. Why does it say sefer krisis to teach me this halacha? V'idach, and the Chacham are going to tell you karis krisis like darsha. They don't dash in this whole extra karis krisis. And now we're going to learn a new Mishnah in regards to the halachas of a get. It says like this: Ein kaisvim b'mechuber l'karka. You're not allowed to write a get on anything that's attached to the ground. Something which is mechuber l'karka, you're not allowed to write a get. Like Rashi says, the ksiv v'kosav v'nosan, that you have to, when you write it, you have to be able to give it, and it cannot be mechusar tzitza. You cannot have, like you said, an extra step. You have to cut it off. Now, ksav b'mechuber, if one wrote it on something that was attached to the ground, and then tloshoi, and then afterwards he detached it, v'chasamei nasanala, then he signed it and gave it to her. So it's kosher. According to Tanakama, it will be kosher. Rabbi Yehuda Pesel, Rabbi Yehuda says it will be puzzle. Why? Because the writing and its signings have to be performed when it's detached. So again, you're not allowed to write something which is mechuber l'karka. What if you went ahead and you wrote on a get, you wrote on an object which is mechuber l'karka, and then you went ahead and you detached it, and you wrote it, and then you give it to her? So the Tanakama says it's kosher. Rabbi Yehuda is going to hold it's puzzle because the ksiv and the chesima all have to be all batalish. So we're going to learn, the Gemara is going to learn differently with them. What's the problem? Now, Rabbi Yehuda ben Pseira says, "Ein kaisen le'aniyar hamochuk b'le'hala diftra." He says you're not allowed to write a get on erased paper or unfinished leather. Why? Because writing on these surfaces can be forged. The Chachamim and the Chacham hold, Machshin and the Chacham are going to say that it is kosher. Okay, so now the Gemara asks, the Mishnah said that if you write the get on if it's mechuber l'karka, right? The Mishnah says that ein kaisvin b'mechuber l'karka. Then the Mishnah said kasvei b'mechuber. If you went ahead and you wrote it when it was connected to the ground, and then you disconnected it and signed it, the get is kosher. But you literally just said in the Reisha of the Mishnah, ein kaisvin, you're not allowed to write on a get which is mechuber l'karka. So you're saying ein kaisvin b'mechuber l'karka, and then you're saying, but if you wrote it, as long as you plucked it away before you signed it, it's good. So Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel says, the second Mishnah that says that the get is kosher, if it's mechuber l'karka, is talking about shashir b'makom ha'teiref, at the sefer left over place in the teiref of the get. As we explained a few days ago, in a get you have two items of the get. You have the teiref of the get and you have the teifus of the get. The teifus of the get is basically the standard template. Every get has the same l'shainis, and then the teiref is like the dates, the names, and everything. So the teifus is regular. When it comes to the teiref, here we're talking about at the sefer left over place in the actual teiref, and he did not write the teiref of the get till after it was detached from the ground. As long as the teiref, which is the central primary part of the gittin, that was written after it was detached, then it's okay. As long as you left over makim on the teiref. The Gemara says, our Mishnah goes like Rebbe Lazar. The Omri, as we said many times, Eidei Mesir Karti, who severs the Gittin, is the Eidim which testify on the Mesiras Haget. They are the ones that actually affect the get. And like the Gemara says, this is what the Mishnah means to say. In case when teifus shema yichtav teiref. Ideally, you're not allowed to write even the standard part on something that is attached to the ground. Why? Because maybe you're going to write the teiref also connected to the ground. But if you wrote the standard part while it was attached to the ground and then detached it, wrote the essential part and gave it to her, then kosher is kosher. Okay, now the Mishnah is going to explain different halachis in regards to the get that's written on things that are mechuba the karka. No, I'm sorry, I skipped. Rish Lakish says the Mishnah should not be understood that way. That the signing is referring to the writing of the essential part. Rather, he says chosmu shanino. We learned and they signed, which is referring to the signatures of the witness. In case fin tatif, you don't write the tatif. Why say shema yachdim? So the tatif and tlashu chasama in the sunlight, then it will be kosher. Okay, so now in connection with this discussion, the Gemara now mentions several halachas that are affected by items being attached to the ground or detached. If he wrote a get on a clay, which is a pot, it's a kli cheretz, and this kli cheretz had otzos nokov. It had a hole in it. Now, we discussed this a few times that whenever you have a cheretz which has a hole in it, it's considered like attached to the ground. So, if a person wrote a get on cheres, which was attached to the ground, so then the halacha is kosher. The halacha is that it's kosher. Why is it a kosher get? Why? Because he could take this pot and give it to her. Now, if, however, he wrote it on a leaf of a plant growing in a otzos nakuf, so now what's the din? So in the first cases, he wrote it on a cheres of otzos nakuf, so even though it's attached to the ground, we say that he can go ahead and take the pot and give it to her. But if he wrote it on an olive, which is on a plant growing in this otzos nakuf, so now you have machlekes. Abaya Amar kosher, Rabba Amar pasol. Abaya says it's kosher, Rabba will say it's pasol. Abaya Amar kosher. Abaya is going to say that it's kosher. Why does Abaya hold that it's kosher? Because the shokal levi nahali, you could take this otzitz and you can give it there. And Rav is going to say no, it's going to be pasol. Why? Gzeda shema yiktim. Because even though I make a decree that maybe somebody will detach the leaf and give it to her. Now, and then the get will be pasol even min ha teira. Okay, stop here for a minute and then we'll continue.